So welcome to the second week in Social Movements in the Global South, or as it's known under the other code, Southern Social Movements and Theory. This particular lecture for today will be relevant to understand why we use a phrase such as Southern Social Movements and Theory, particularly as pertains to kind of turning things around, not just looking from the north, but also beginning to encounter and engage with theories and perspectives from the south. What is it to think from the south? That's what we'll be focusing on, and to locate ourselves as well. But before we get started, I'm just going to make sure everything's sort of tallied up here. And I did want to make just a very brief reference to what's happened over the last week. Yeah, it's a lot to take in. If you have family, loved ones from Iran, that makes it even more so. I suppose seeing it all unroll just leaves you without words, right? And so the first place I turned was back to poetry, because I feel like some poets say it so much better than I, and particularly in regard to the successive wars that have taken place in the Middle East. So I wanted to share something from a Canadian Lebanese poet by the name of Trish Salah, who's the author of a book called Wanting in Arabic. Let me see if I can bring that up, just as a sort of moment to think and dwell with. I've got it as a JPEG file. So, oh yeah, it's loaded. That's good. Okay. Let me just share that one. And I'll make sure this is recording for whomever isn't able to come today. Welcome. I just thought I'd start off with a moment of pause, because things are escalating rapidly between Israel, the United States, Iran, and also in Lebanon. And it's obviously very distressing, but it's not entirely new. I feel that the US, in entering into this war, is being very reckless, first of all, breaking international law and norms around this kind of thing. But we have many historical antecedents, not just in the region, but with the United States assuming its so-called role as an interventionist force, right? Historically, in Latin America, that has been either through the use of counterinsurgency agencies such as the CIA interfering in local democracies. And we'll talk about that one when you have me in the second half of the semester, particularly in regard to Chile, but also, you know, across that time. So, you know, it's really hard to sort of package it all in one little narrative. But the US has always seen its Western, or it terms its Western hemisphere as being its backyard, yeah? And so Latin America has borne the brunt of that over time, yeah? And even now, within some of the Southern Cone countries like Argentina and also Paraguay, and let's say also some of the Andean countries that had leftist populist governments, there's been a swing to the right, and that's seen as being favorable to the US. And so we can't underestimate the sort of covert, but also overt techniques of war and domination exercised by the US and its allies. But I wanted to bring in some poetry rather than politics writ large. I wanted to draw on the work of Trish Salah and her poem sequence from Wanting in Arabic that's called Ghazals in Fugue. So this is part 5, and I just remember waking up to hearing about the bombing of the girls' school in Minab in the south of Iran. A few things came to mind clearly. I mean, one of the things is naming intervention against a brutal regime in the name of liberating women. Yeah. And if you think about it, the bombing of a girls' school, first of all, if they were able to so surgically target the supreme leader and his cabinet successfully, with a targeted assassination, how is it that they just accidentally hit a school, you know? And that's so many lives cut short. And that flies in the face of what the United States is saying about its moral jurisdiction. And there's many things we could think about in relation to that, and certainly Trump. But I also wanted us to think more, and this is all around the politics of location as well, around war. So Trusella gives us a bit of an inroad, and it's from the book Wanting in Arabic, and she is a Canadian Lebanese poet. Beyond the compound, illegible to itself, the war asks its children to hold it. Who holds still to read a war? Caught in our race, each day we have our watchers. Behind blinds, driving by attentive as dogs or cops, they ask, like in a war, at the movies, as if we're spies, what do they want? Why are they here? We ask the same questions. They're different questions prized from war. We listen to miles in the car, all by mountains at war with, years, miles away, as in New York, as if New York wants for terror. This Afghan war, here we have a precedent, right, under the previous administrations. Slaughter all fanatics, the misogynists, and history too. They're no longer in our pay. There's no balm our grief like war. Whitman praised your sensuous and muscular form, but the body which moves because the mind cannot fugues the world as war. To answer your question, they're the same. America, war. A different war, to hold it at bay, even this question of war. Without signs of home, what is our common destination? The common place of departure? Do we tarry out of love with war? So obviously this all erupts in the context of 9/11, yeah? And I don't know, going around the room, probably, you were too young to actually see that unfold, yeah? I don't know if you've watched documentaries or studied it before. At the time that happened on September 11, 2001, I was an exchange student in Mexico, and they instantly closed the borders. But I remember hearing local newspaper journalists driving around with loudspeakers saying, America at war, America at war. And it struck me very strangely because my first intake of the images of the bombing, of the crashing of planes into the Twin Towers was actually on screens as I walked to class. And I thought it was an action movie. A lot of us kind of responded in that way, like, how can this be? But then we began to see that successive incursions and declarations of war, such as finding the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, were used as the motive to declare war on Iraq and completely destabilize and destroy that nation, in the process. And now the current administration claims that the threat of nuclear arms from Iran is imminent, even though they reputedly destroyed the infrastructure earlier in strikes on Iran, last year. So there's a lot of recurrences. There's a lot of things that would be of concern, like, is this liberation? People might think that by killing an 86-year-old man who was probably already on his way out, that that's going to result in regime change, right? So they're difficult questions, but I encourage us to think about the different repertoires of war, because in this study, obviously political struggle from below is often intricately linked to the experiences of war and violence as well, both to create alternatives and to rebuild communities, but also when people are caught in the crossfire. We don't look in great detail with Lucia at Iran, but you can definitely in your own work, if it interests you, for example, look at the woman life freedom movement and the different things that, of course, have occurred even before the current strikes, in Iran, and also the sort of geopolitical matters of what lenses used to understand the political realities of both Iran and neighboring countries. So we're never really too far from the so-called Middle East, right? Or we're not disconnected at all, really. globally. Another poem that came to mind in hearing about the bombing of the girls' school was by Adrienne Rich, the North American Jewish poet, lesbian feminist. She wrote a poem called The School Among the Ruins, and it begins with, if I can find it really quickly, The School Among the Ruins. And of course, looking at forerunners to the current aggressive actions of the US and Israel. Let's see if I can bring it up. Does anyone know of the work of Adrienne Rich? Very renowned and celebrated, but very political as well. She was once awarded the Presidential Medal of Poetry, and she refused it. Yeah, so that was under the Clinton administration. So the poem was written in the wake of 9/11. Let me see if I can find an online version. Not sure if they have it. Oh, okay, yeah, they're doing okay. I won't read the whole thing, but it takes place in a school after recovery, after the bombing of cities like Baghdad, but not only because they've been successive wars declared in the name of regime change, liberation, ending violence, bringing peace, and so on. So it begins with Beirut, Baghdad, Sarajevo, Bethlehem, Kabul. Not here, of course, not of course here. Yeah. So that's something to be mindful of in terms of the politics of location. What kind of relationship do we have globally to what is going on right now, but also to these histories of war? Teaching the first lesson and the last, great falling light of summer, will you last longer than school time? When children flow in columns at the doors, boys, girls, and the busy teachers open or close high windows, with hooked poles, drawing dark green shades, closets unlocked, locked, questions unasked, asked, when love of the fresh, impeccable, sharp-penciled yes, order without cruelty. A street on earth, neither heaven nor hell, busy with commerce and worship. Young teachers walking to school. Fresh bread and early open food stalls. 2. When the offensive rocks the sky, when night glare misconstrues day and night, when lived-in rooms from the upper city tumble, cratering lower streets, cornices of old ornament, human debris, when fear vacuums out the streets, when the whole town flinches, blood on the undersole, thickening to glass. Whoever crosses hunched knees, bent a contested zone, knows why she does this suicidal thing. Schools now in session day and night, children sleep in the classrooms, teachers rolled close. And so it's about survival in the midst of war, you know, in the context of what erupted after 9/11, the war on terror. And, you know, we're still living in many ways that moment, if you sort of pause to think. But Rich also wrote about the politics of location. And so that is the subject of today's lecture, let's say. She said it was very important to be able to locate ourselves, what our relationship is to the centers of power, yeah? And those expressions of violence, which are said to be legitimate when a state, in the name of liberation or democracy, undertakes forms of violence in the name of domination and war. Okay, now I just got to maximize it. Okay, let's just do the slideshow. All right, the world al revés. So I'm mixing Spanish and English. I think from the image, you can probably tell that there is one image in the background, which is of a city upside down, and another looking through a glass, which turns it up the right way. But what is the right way to look at the world? It really depends on from whence we view things. And this is often called, at least in terms of theory and critical engagement, the way we speak, yeah? The locus of enunciation. So today we're going to be considering what it means to shift the view and to move from very hegemonic northern productions, both in theory and in politics, you could say, and to think more from what we're calling the South, how that involves the geopolitics of knowledge. So what is thinking from the South? Well, it involves becoming part of a conversation about the concepts and perspectives, ways of thinking and doing that are best suited to the studying of movements in the South, different forms of political resistance, and organizing socially otherwise. Such movements cannot merely be understood through the analytical and interpretive devices, even categories of social movement theories developed in the North, which are, as we saw last week, largely developed based on Northern experiences. Yeah. Thinking from the South requires radically being or becoming aware of our position, our experiences, our bases, but also biases from which we work and write. All knowledge, including theory, then is shaped by what I've referred to as the locus of enunciation. We must become conscious of the locationality of knowledge, the geopolitics of knowledge, and the political economy of knowledge production. An example, we think about global North and global South in terms of the economic system, right? A lot of the time, and even development policy, the history of development, discourse and policy. Do we think about knowledge in these ways? If you look at academic journals, the most prestigious are in the English language, yeah, and also located within the Northern Academy, particularly in the United States, right? There's an assumption that all knowledge flows that way. But I want to suggest that we need to actually understand the basis out of which that prioritization of Northern knowledges and publications and industry proceeds, and question whether we're just going to take on theorists from the North, yeah, whether they be from sociology, like Pierre Bourdieu. To be frank, he's very useful in some regards, but why go there automatically? Why is it that in the Times literary supplement, I think of 2010, all the top theorists were European and male and mostly dead? Okay, may he rest in peace, Pierre Bourdieu, right? But what I'm getting at here, is not an accident. That is not an accident. It's about the way in which knowledge flows economically. And if you are from different institutions or communities and parts of the global South, it's not like you don't produce knowledge, including in academic journals, but the game is not necessarily in your favor, let's say. And that could be in various branches of knowledge. There was a physicist from Kolkata by the name of Bose. The boson particle was named after him. Yeah. So about 100 years ago, he wrote a paper that he shared with Einstein. He couldn't break through into publication in the top journals, yeah, in Europe or the United States, even in that field. But just by sending this non-peer-reviewed article to Einstein, Einstein read it and realized this guy's onto something, right? And so it's only by teaming up with Einstein that he was able to develop the work that they both did together. But here you have an example of someone who was an original thinker located within the colonized world, yeah? So India was still under the sway of Britain at that stage. But questions of the circuits of knowledge, who has access, whose voices rise to the top, very much follow those lines of colonialism as well. And we'll get on to that. But I just wanted to make reference as well to the image on the side. It's in Spanish. It says Movimientos Sociales del Sur Occidente Colombiano en Minga por la Paz. Lanzamiento 23 al 25 de noviembre de 2016. So that's 10 years ago. A Minga is the concept of a kind of communal form of organization, yeah? It's often place-based, not only in reference to Colombia, but amongst indigenous peoples who work together in communal work, yeah? It has latterly become the basis for social and political organization, yeah, in the face of violence by the Colombian state, for example, towards indigenous peoples. But we cannot really understand a Minga unless we understand it on its own terms, right? Minga is a term that relates to mutual aid, mutual work, to which all people commit and have a role. So if those units already exist within the ancestral lines of indigenous groups in the Andes, yeah, they may have other names, indeed sometimes they do, but if they already exist, and then they become the grounds for further political activation, how can mainstream, that is Northern social movement theory, assist if its particular paradigms don't account for that embeddedness? To what extent is resource mobilization theory useful when these pre-existing networks that require a kind of commitment communally don't fit within the language of social movement theories of the North? Yeah, just to give an example. So these Mingas, forms of mobilization that rely on pre-existing structures that don't require opportunity structures, they simply exist and mobilize, yeah? In this case, march on different capitals, which gathers massive numbers of indigenous groups in the country in Colombia. So really speaking, we're talking about valuing the epistemologies, the knowledge systems of the South as embedded in practice as well. Those in the South, both located in the South and North, and we'll see why shortly, those who struggle against oppression and domination have, we could say, epistemological advantage. They know the realities better than people in the North. Yeah, they theorize them better. This requires to draw on the work of Catherine Walsh, who's at one of the universities, an intercultural university in Ecuador. We're talking about other conceptual and political frameworks, other knowledge production from other subjects, marked not simply by distinctions of class, but by the lived experience of coloniality and the racialized structure that it has engendered. So you probably discussed this binary of global North and global South in other units. Have you done so earlier in your studies? We don't want to freeze frame it into an absolute. It's really relational. The term global South moves beyond strict geography. It's not defined by geography, but by interconnected histories of colonialism, neo-imperialism, and systemic marginalization with the systems that are brought about by colonialism and imperialism. The concept is fundamentally relational, defined by sets of relations of domination, incursion, and subjection in, for the purposes of this lecture, a Euro-centered knowledge economy that privileges thinking about the social and the political from European sources. Now, Matthew's Spark actually says the South is everywhere, but always somewhere. And that might seem to you to be aphoristic, even mysterious. But what he's pointing to there, well, first of all, what do you think he might be pointing to? If we think about the South and where it is. Yeah. Exactly. In particular and multiple locations. Absolutely. That's right. Have the opportunity to publish in paper or in research to explore because of certain histories that relate to kind of very within context. Exactly. And in that sense, they inherit those dynamics and follow those circuits. Now, in thinking about changing this up, Walter Mignolo, who's an Argentine decolonial theorist, says the following. He talks about the geopolitics of knowledge. He says, we need to stop thinking that what counts as knowledge is in certain languages and comes from certain places only. Yeah. we need to stop thinking that perhaps the Zapatistas have been producing a theoretical, political, and ethical evolution in their own workings. How am I going to think with reference to the Zapatistas or Fanon, Frantz Fanon, who produce knowledge based on other histories, if we only make, for example, reference to Jürgen Habermas and the political public sphere to account for the longue durée of Zapatista organizing and the creation of a new kind of civil society in Mexico, for example, even transnationally. So we have the Northern lens, which inherits those histories of imperial reason, of the appropriation of lands and also labor, and ironically ransacks local knowledges. Maybe sees value in them in the colonial project, but as a kind of source of data or a resource, yeah, that needs to be uplifted or incorporated into the imperial machine. The South then surrenders resources and data to that apparatus. But unfortunately, even those of us who are located in the academy, here in Australia as well, within a geographical South at least, are also caught up in that kind of trap, yeah? What Paolo Ondaatje, who's an African scholar, refers to as the extraversion trap. The demand that Southern subjects make sense of themselves exclusively through Northern analytical devices, yielding raw material while the North produces theory. So he noted that amongst the scholarship of African scholars, there was always that pressure, right, to interpret local experience through Northern theoretical frameworks as well. And that hasn't gone away. I'd say that one of my early pieces of work, which was looking at the formation of a particular law on the borderlands between the US and Mexico, the first theorists I turned to were Marx, Bourdieu, and yeah, basically those, big names. And I began to ask myself, why am I doing this? Is it going to help me get in the door? Or what am I privileging here? Yeah. Of course, I found other sources who engaged with Bourdieu, but did so, for example, the work of Mariana Valverde and others. But there is always that, especially in an academy driven by metrics, that you have to publish in the so-called quartile one journals to make appeals to Northern theory as universal, and sideline those being produced in one's own context. So thinking about context and where we are, now, last week I said, I'm clearly not Aboriginal, but this is Aboriginal country. And it is also a place of unique knowledge systems that continue to exist. And we can make reference to philosophical thought and science encoded within myth as well, and dreamtime stories about the environment, about land, We can think about the way in which those stories also encode law and responsibility, and they are systems that were pre-established, We can also look at contemporary examples of what mobilizes people in places like Northern Western Australia and the Kimberley in fighting against resource extraction. And in other parts of, well, ironically, it's Australia's north that's seen as being the place to mine, not its south. The elites tend to live in the south, right? Or the southern states. But looking at the instances of the kind of ecological knowledges that Aboriginal peoples enacted for millennia, as well as contemporary instances of resistance, provides a locus of enunciation that's not necessarily found, within Marx's accounts, And also the work of Indigenous feminists in different genres, So I can think of the work of Ruby Langford and her book, Don't Take Your Love to Town. Has anyone read that? But also Aileen Montran Robinson, Talking Up to the White Woman, which is a bit of a classic. So what knowledges are there here? And how do they assist people to live their lives and also resist? One can think about the Desert Knowledges Precinct, which is in Central Australia, and that kind of canvases and brings together knowledge systems of Western Desert peoples, including the Aranda people. Yeah? It's beginning to be taken seriously by some university institutions, but there's also that risk, as we'll see at the end, of what we call extractivism, yeah, with Indigenous knowledge in this country. So earlier reference was made to the way in which the South gets kind of constructed, yeah, as a kind of other, but also, you know, through a northern lens as unruly, exotic, underdeveloped, yeah, by reference to thinking that's very Orientalist. The idea that southern spaces are just sites of disorder, not the disorder brought about by development from the north or wars from the north, for example. But we could recast that if we're going to invert the view a little bit and say, what about the South as a site of innovation around resistance, solidarity, emancipatory knowledge, and histories of struggle that people learn from? One thing that's really interesting, when the war in Gaza was really brutally underway, I have a Palestinian friend that was able to get third country resettlement and was in Greece, right? But his family was still in Palestine. He constantly would invoke Che Guevara, yeah? And obviously, a lot of people dream that way, through symbols, through imagery, in the face of such genocide. But that gives hope as well, regardless of what you think of Che Guevara, because he was a very complex figure, actually, and we can make critical interrogations of what he represented. But we all know that famous photograph, yeah, the revolutionary kind of thing. So, you know, that's the context of Cuba. Well, actually, he was an Argentine doctor, but, you know, he was instrumental in the struggle that led to the Cuban Revolution in 1959. And so he's called upon by a Palestinian. Yeah? These are examples of the way in which knowledges do flow across the South-South axis as well. So the South is not just a cardinal direction, it is a relational concept. As Spark says, the South is everywhere, but always somewhere. It exists also in the margins of the global North, amongst migrants, refugees, and Indigenous peoples. Who read the work of Shimin Fareh for today? There was an article by her. She says, for example, that the two South African anthropologists, it's a married couple, Komarov and Komarov, have called for the inverting of the order of things by developing theory based on empirical studies of the Global South, from the Global South. They believe that currently the Global South provides a much more useful context for analysis of the world, as pervasive transformation and dynamics are by far more present in the South in comparison to the North. So Southern theoretical perspectives actually already exist, as I've been pointing to, including in regard to Indigenous Australia, but they're commonly passed over, especially when they don't circulate in the English language. You know? Quechua and Andean thought would be two such instances. Zapatista philosophy, Islamic ethics, what gets called also pensamiento cimarrón, and popular education. We'll see a few examples of that in the next few slides. Here's a compendium that's useful to look at. It's called Pluriverse. You can look at it in your own time, look at the PowerPoint, click on that link. It tracks through some different schools of critical thinking and action, such as decolonial theory, autonomous, decolonial, and community feminisms, Indigenous and Afro-descendant thinking, the diverse range of debates around climate crisis, but also alternative economies, political ecology, economies of new solidarity, social solidarity, communal and common economies, new spiritualities, and different proposals for civilizational transition. So that's a post-development dictionary, and it contains a lot of information about these sources of knowledge, you know, from the pluriverse. The work of Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui, who's an Andean oral historian and Aymara sociologist, yeah, based in Bolivia, she comes up with the concept of ecologies of knowledge, especially via reference to Chichi. Yeah, so the Chichi concept is allowing things to come together without differences being annulled. Yeah. So she uses the example of colors. Yeah. A color that is produced by contrast. So what may look heather gray from a distance is actually just because you have put together black and white. And then optically, it suggests something gray. But black does not annul white or other colors. You might remember that meme that went around about that purple dress that looked green. Remember that a few years ago? And people were saying, no, it's absolutely green. And others are saying, this is the observer effect. It could actually be both. Yeah. So if we think about the ecology of knowledge as that way, allowing things to come into conjunction, but not seeking to annihilate the differences, holding them together, that arguably is a productive metaphor for rethinking the sources of knowledges that we can draw upon. So that's not to say that Bourdieu is completely useless, right? But we don't privilege Bourdieu if we're looking at Andean political realities above the work of someone like Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui. And also concepts that emerge within the Mayan, I've gone to Mexico, the Aymaran language itself, how it conceives time, how it conceives place. Yeah, these are all very consequential. So the Chichi world for her is exactly that, thinking through Aymara and from the Aymaran way. So what about if we take ourselves to non-Indigenous contexts, and not only Indigenous contexts? Well, we can look at examples of the frontline and the way people organize and what they do within their spaces. So movements are also intellectual spaces. The intellectual work and knowledge that they produce is frequently not seen by those outside of the movements. Yeah. They involve cognitive practices. This is a term from Aziz Chowdhury, learning activism. Critical learning involves people theorizing their lived experiences, standing back, reordering realities using concepts of power, conflict, and structure, generated from local contexts, and what he calls, and his colleague Dip Kapoor calls, fugitive knowledges. That is, not necessarily institutionalized, like within the academy, forms of knowledge, that are actually about joining the dots, working out one's own reality, yeah, and how to respond, emerging from the ground. One really good example of this is from one expression of the Mexican student movement. And a lot of the elections of the past 20 years in Mexico have been very much interrogated, disputed in terms of whether the results are legitimate or whether there's been, vote swapping or buying, particularly when the dominant party has just got back in power. Yeah. It's not the case right now, but at least when hashtag Yo Soy 132, which was an informal, digitally organized group of students who wanted to oppose the election of one of the dominant party's candidates, yeah, as being corrupt, and force him to go on camera to talk with them. They organized, yeah, both on university campuses like the La Universidad Iberoamericana, which is a private university, so the middle-class students from Mexico's capital, but they also made great and nifty use of social media and their digital networks to really get this up on the ground, yeah? And they learned from one another. They weren't able to get the then Peña Nieto, president of Mexico, to go live on camera and to have a debate, but they thrust it into the limelight, yeah? And they continued to activate that way with any of the inconsistencies, not just electoral, but in terms of the kinds of crises that occurred during his period in power, 6 years in Mexico. They amassed then networking resources, but they also learned within their spaces of organizing. And so one particular article points up that learning did not just happen in their universities, it also occurred across 46 categories of informal learning in assemblies, in marches, in camps, and crisis management situations. So we can see that it encompassed not just formal education, but non-formal education and informal education on the run, if you like. So it's very interesting to look at how students generate their own knowledge as well, yeah, through their networking. So then we can think about those greater movements, such as the Zapatistas, that are territorialized. Also, you could think about the contest of Brazil, Northeast Brazil, and the landless workers movement. Has anyone heard of that group? It's called MST. It's the biggest social movement in the world. It's got like millions of members, and they've grown over the past sort of 30 to 40 years. But effectively, they have their own school systems. Yeah. So it's not that they're just training militants, although there might be a space for that, right? It's also that they're looking at sustainable agriculture using agroecology. The Zapatistas do that as well. Raul Zibechi, who I referred to last week, the Uruguayan social theorist, says militants in such movements are not just formed by reading classic authors, but by doing and sharing. Yeah. So academics usually apply theory to movements, but we actually should learn from them. Knowledge is not just here codified in books, but exists, as I said, in joining the dots, in struggle. And then for these larger movements like the Zapatistas and the landless workers group, we have actual schools, yeah, as well. So to turn to the Zapatistas in Chiapas, southern state of Mexico, here we can see Escuela Primaria Rebelde Autónoma Zapatista, the Zapatista Autonomous Rebel Primary School. And they've got beautiful murals down there as well. Education is autonomy. They're intimately linked. They have people who are promoters for education and health amongst the community. They're not led by, their governance structures are not led by people who are elected by some kind of voting system that we associate with liberal democracy, but instead they have a rotating committee that is chosen and they lead by obeying. That's their philosophy. The curriculum at the schools seeks to recover Indigenous ancestral herbal medicine and agroecological practices, in which women are really important as well. And they seek to break down the walls between school as kind of edifice and learning that goes on in community. Now, as this childhood chimes with the importance of looking at examples of the way Indigenous groups in resistance are organising, because some of the most cogent and systemic challenges against capitalist globalisation have emerged from their movements. Self-determination, but also in light of the longer histories of resistance to colonialism. Indigenous peoples' continued assertions of self-determination and the move to decolonisation are a rich but oftentimes overlooked source of theory and critique of both capitalist and economic systems themselves. The Zapatistas have made many communiques and released them worldwide, and they contain stories and folklore, but they also contain messages that are analytical about the capitalist system, yeah. And they've also organised congresses, which they call many world sort of congresses, bringing together activists from all over the world. This is from the article Global Justice Question, Contesting NGOization, Knowledge Politics and Containment in Anti-Globalization Networks. So to move with the Zapatistas, we might say that we have to walk about asking questions. So it's a form of pedagogy, yeah? Caminar preguntando. Don't close ourselves to asking questions, including if we're going into spaces or areas, yeah, that we're unsure about, where we might not be part of those communities. But asking questions potentially gets a response where we listen, yeah? Don't enter a field just assuming that we have the preset theories, yeah, that we're going to apply. Instead, we use knowledge by walking with it, walking in those contexts. I mean, you won't necessarily go to Chiapas this semester, but let's say there are different ways in which, at least through sources and methods of engagement, that you can do this process, this methodology. Now, the image that you can see up on the left features a turtle which represents the slow but deliberate progress, a counter narrative to the rapid extraction of the hair that is used by grassroots movements in Mexico, including the Zapatistas, but also those young people who activated within the context of the teachers' movement in Oaxaca, which is another southern state of Mexico, and in light of the kidnapping of students from another southern state. And so they're involved in a form of rebellion, and the instance of the Oaxacan commune is a good instance of that, young women, young men, but also cognizant of the fact that they might not have all the recipes for success and change then and there, but that they were forming something, and that by asking questions about one's social reality, one could seek to intervene and come up with different responses as well. And so Caminar Preguntando also engages that. It's deep listening and co-construction of knowledge, however long it takes. Now, when we make reference to kind of knowledge systems that are useful in the context of social movements, for example, in Latin America, some writers have thought about what they term cultures of politics and the politics of cultures. The myriad political, sometimes ancestral forms that exist of associational power and capacity for reciprocal work, like I referenced in the Minga. That is to recast what we see as the political field to actually include these formations that are not necessarily understood by mainstream social movement theorizations. Yeah. We can see that across Andean societies, and we can also see that within Mexico. So there's a lot of assembly forms and forms of communal decision-making that occur that are leaderless as well. Yeah, or that have, as I said, in the case of the Zapatistas, a rotating leadership. Some other foci that you can consider in regard to Abya Yala, Latin America, include an interest in societies and pueblos in movement as territories in resistance. Yeah, they could be urban territories, not just rural. Also, an interest in the subjectivities of struggle. Yeah, the sort of dynamic of subordination being made into a subaltern, but also insubordination. When does that arise? How does it arise? The work of Massimo Molinesi, who's based in Mexico and originally Italian, is useful in bringing in some stuff from Gramsci, but also seeking to understand the dynamics of local realities. Yeah. Diane Davis talks about the degree of proximity that some movements have to the state or distance from, and how that impacts on organizing. So that's particularly pertinent for Indigenous and Afro-descendant groups in Latin America. And then also those ethnographies, for example, that look at the way in which autonomy is organized, including via community governance in the realm of education, health, freedom from violence. Yeah, they're very important to think about. So before we end things, because we only have another 10 minutes, if you read the article by Ximene Fedei and also the introductory chapter, The Global Social Movements in the Global South by Sarah Motta and Alf Nielsen, can you think of anything that brings different movements across the South together? What perspectives does Ximene Fedei offer, for example? Some of them we've already sort of seeded there. We talked about histories of colonialism, didn't we? The subaltern. The importance of attending to political context, yeah. Yes, exactly. But looking at the different relationships between state and civil society as well. Yeah. Hmm. What motivates movements? Hmm. Material versus identity. And then she also brings up intersectionality, doesn't she? It's always ever present. Hmm. What about in the other chapters? Does anyone have any other things to reflect on? Yeah. Mm, yes. Mhm. It's not only class. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Very good. And those two last points really connect, I think. So being really attentive to histories and political economy from below, the experience of colonialism and imperialism, grounds that breaks open for social action, but also the forms of domination and subalternization that exist. It's really important. We need to be able to understand how that has affected state formation, including post-colonial states, such as India, yeah? In India, but also how that kind of breaks apart a unitary analysis, for example, based on class only. So some things that we can think about when theorizing from the South. Next week with Lucia, in the tutorial, you'll actually be reading a piece, I believe, by Mark Levine, and it's all about how can we potentially think through the paradigm of the coloniality of power, which comes from the Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano, but in the context of Middle East and North Africa. We're going to be beginning those conversations connecting parts of the South and understanding that colonialism isn't just an event, as Patrick Wolf would say in the context of Australia, but a structure. Yeah. So Australia doesn't somehow go missing from this picture either. But colonial power concept is really powerful because it says that, you know, the European account, the Euro-centered knowledge economy account, that somehow colonialism is then exceeded or succeeded by modernity and modernization and so on, is very much a European perspective. And it erases the fact that even if there has been a decolonization process, such as in the instance of the independence of India and its partition, the creation of India and Pakistan, and then latterly Bangladesh, and in other parts of Asia, there's also been decolonization movements. It doesn't mean that colonial logics and processes somehow go away, or even structures, yeah, and hierarchies of ordering things globally. They still inherit, yeah, from the previous eras on race, gender, spirituality, sexuality, obviously class, but that the first moment of the kind of colonial order is actually in 1492. And that's where even ideas of race begin to be born through European otherizing, yeah, of native peoples found in the so-called New World. But those knowledges about what we call race are instituted through those histories and are allied to purposes of domination. So theorizing from locations, centering land, labor, and life, and thinking through the lens of concepts such as coloniality of power, which takes us from the meso to the micro, but also the macro, thinking about the world system is important. We still need to be able to think through different locations because things like neoliberal policy are experienced differently in different geographies, yeah, through the very unequal system of the world economy. A rigorous intersectionality is required, not just identity-based, but also mediated by material concerns. Sometimes it's hard to hive them off from one another, especially when mass mobilizations occur because of a tax reform brought in or increasing pauperization and economic crisis. So, you know, it's not so easy just to divide one off from the other. That's where the Chichi thinking could be useful, holding them together in tension. What do these things look like from the South, in particular Middle East, North Africa, and Latin America? especially with worlds shaped by neoliberalism and neoliberal governance? What optics are afforded by decolonial feminism as well, and feminist economy analysis? Because there's a lot, both within places like Egypt, but also in Latin America. How can we read power and, given what we started off with today, the registers of war on and from women's bodies, which is so often put as the grounds for contestation of all sorts of political designs, simultaneously feminized and racialized? How can we locate and make connections in the political subject making and networks, even strategies of resistance? From what grounds do people struggle and how do they connect? Yeah. Is it useful to think of the concept of transversality as well as intersectionality? Processes of articulation. So, finishing up, one thing that you might find in some material is a bringing together of considerations of obviously right authoritarianism and military governance in countries in Middle East and North Africa and Latin America, as found in the work of Paul Amar, and how sometimes they're mirrored with development projects. That is, the desire to seize land and develop infrastructural projects, yeah, by violent means. Yeah. Neoliberalism isn't chiefly about market ethos and policy, fiscal discipline, or even hyper-individualism. In parts of the South, it's also neo-developmentalist. It reorganizes agriculture, results in the reprimarization of commodities, natural resources, the rolling back of nation-state focused growth, and the further creation of labor polarization, income inequality, and new forms of informality of labor. Reading neoliberalism from the South, we must confront its different origins, trajectories, and impacts. We can't just assume that one size fits all, even. And even amid leftist and progressivist governance, there's a range of regime types. There have also been new assemblies of coercive economic policy and wars of governance being enacted, wars on nature, extractivism of the biosphere, encroachment of life worlds and peoples, and dispossession. But we should also be attendant to the new resistance subjectivities that emerged there, even within leftist populist states. Yeah. So this is where we'll end, and we'll take some things to the tutorial. Having said all this and emphasized the importance of being able to turn things around and see and think from the South, we can't fall back into that trap of extractivism. We have to think through our methods, think through our sources as well. It's not enough to extract stories about movements to publish in the North. There must be dialogue, which is why we're bringing together these two quote unquote regions as well. Knowledge production that serves the movement first and the academy second. Key question, is your research going to be about taking data or engaging with voices in the South? Thank you very much, and I'll see you in the tutorial.